The first is Gregory's call for the Christian to know her own soul as reflecting the divine. The second concerns the church as a body wherein God is made visible. One might think these two themes quite distinct in focus, but my aim is to show how deeply Gregory's quite distinctive account of the Christian's gaze on her own soul is only comprehensible when we place it in the ecclesiological context that he also offers here. The argument that I want to trace may be sketched as follows. I will argue first that when we place Gregory's argument against the background of previous discussions of self-knowing, we see a distinctive emphasis. Gregory offers a picture in which self-knowing does not only involve knowing that one's logos is that which is most truly one's own, but also that the soul is more and more clearly known as the activity and performance of interrelated virtues grows. But, and here is the paradox, we know ourselves more truly and we come to see the divine in the mirror of the soul as we come to recognize that the virtues are also given. They are forms of activity in which the bridegroom is also active. We know ourselves then, we see in the mirror of the soul, when we know that what is most our own is also being made clearer and more active through the action of spirit and bridegroom upon and within us. But at the same time, we grow in understanding of this dynamic of manifestation as we come to see that the bridegroom is bringing about patterns of manifestation within his body. If we come to manifest the superabundance of the divine life, we do so for the purpose of knitting together the body of Christ. It is at this point that I think we see the distinctively ecclesiological, even episcopal character of these homilies, and we are forced to ask ourselves some hard questions about the common designation of them as mystical. I should say at the outset that this paper was written in response to a request by our host, Father Maspero. Giulio asked me to consider exploring how far Gregory exhibits something like the account of ascent, what I termed a Christological epistemology that I have discerned in Augustine. I'm afraid that at least in this first version of the paper, I must disappoint him. I have something that I would like to contribute to our discussion of this commentary. I can see how it leads to the comparison that I was asked to offer, but that will have to wait for the published version, or at least until question time. My first task, then, is to think carefully through how Gregory envisions appropriate self-knowing. I could have begun by focusing on the language of soul as mirror, and we've already had a wonderful paper on that topic, but I think a different focus will bring out the point that I want to make most clearly. It is probably obvious for this audience, but even had Gregory not seen self-knowledge as necessary for the soul to ascend, the song, of course, presses the topic on any Greek interpreter, simply because in the Septuagint version, verse 1:8 begins, "If you do not know yourself, O beautiful one among women." But for a second, let us step back from the song commentary to provide some background. One of Gregory's most famous reflections on self-knowing is to be found in the sixth of his homilies on the Beatitudes. And here, he seems to offer a very clear vision of seeing the divine reflected in one's purified soul. Quote, "The person who has purged his own heart of every tendency to passion perceives in his own beauty the reflection of the divine nature." The language of vision here is fairly direct. We clean the mirror and then we look into it. And it is no accident, I think, that this passage is taken by Danielou as paradigmatic. My first suggestion today will be that Gregory's account in his homilies on the song is actually far more complex than that found in this justly famous passage. Although I do think that the sixth homily on the Beatitudes itself is consonant with my approach if you look carefully. But before I turn directly to Gregory's text, let me take a few moments to sketch some key aspects of the background against which his distinctive qualities appear. I'll do this by referring to two of his forebears, Origen and Galen. In his work, The Diagnosis and Treatment of the Affections and Errors Peculiar to Each Person's Soul, Galen devotes a significant section of Book 1 to reflecting on the Pythian oracle's injunction, know thyself. Galen assumes here that if the word is taken in its strict sense, self-knowledge is identical with knowledge of one's relationship with the passions. If they are allowed free rein, or if they are under control. The very first passion Galen treats is anger. While everyone should be able to tell that beating or biting one's servants shows that passion has overwhelmed them, in case you wonder, only those who are schooled to be phronimos are able to discern the smaller movements of the soul that also betray anger is taking control. The history of reflection on the oracle's words is, of course, rich and extremely dense. I reference Galen only to emphasize one point. Under the influence of Stoic and what we term Middle Platonic thought, early Christian writers of the Common Era very frequently assume that self-knowing necessarily involves knowing the character of one's control over the passions, a discerning of the soul's activity and life in the world. To get a little closer to Gregory, let us turn to Origen. Origen focuses much attention on the task of self-knowing, and he offers a definition that partly parallels Galen's. Quote, "The soul ought to acquire self-knowledge of a twofold kind. She should know both what she is in herself and how she is moved. That is to say, she ought to know what she is like essentially, in substantia, and what she is like in her movements, in affectibus." Putting off for a while the question of the soul's substance, Origen immediately proceeds to discuss the soul's knowledge of her affections, movements, passions. The soul has to know whether in both thought and action she attends to the cultivation of the virtues. And the soul also needs to know if she does evil intentionally or through some inherent weakness. And it is here how the soul becomes angry and gloomy that draws Origen's attention. Galen's account was resolutely practical and focused on the soul's ability to discern its own patterns of likely action. Origen's additional emphasis on the soul knowing its own intelligible nature, of course, brings forward a theme found in many other reflections on the oracle's injunction to self-knowledge. It is, however, important to note that when he reflects on the soul's recognition of itself as immaterial, Origen emphasizes that only such a recognition will enable discernment of the ordering of the cosmos and appropriate judgment about relative goods. Gregory himself demonstrates, of course, both a clear debt to Origen's reading and a significant shift. When, in his second homily, Gregory comes directly to verse 1:8 of the song, he states immediately, quote, Our greatest safeguard is not to be ignorant of oneself and not to suppose that one is looking at oneself when in fact one is viewing something else." His focus then is on the soul distinguishing its true nature from that which we associate with it. Unlike Origen, Gregory is, at least in this text, not particularly concerned with the material, but with our tendency to associate ourselves with that which is accidental and impermanent, taking the passions as themselves intrinsic to the soul. Now, of course, in other works, Gregory offers a variety of different accounts of whether the passions are intrinsic to the soul. I'm commenting only on this text. In the paragraphs that follow, he makes frequent use of a distinction between that which is our own, to idion, and that which is other, to allotrion. This distinction, I think, owes much to, I think it comes directly from Basil's work, but that need not detain us here. Thus, Gregory takes our first task to be distinguishing between that which is truly stable about oneself, that which is modeled on the intelligible and immaterial nature, and that is our logos. But Gregory insists that this recognition is necessary if we are to judge accurately what is to be pursued, and if we are to judge accurately between good and evil. Gregory even ends this homily, of course, with this rousing paean to the one seeking to know herself, envisaging such a person looking down over the material creation, knowing that only humanity was created as an image of the divine. It is here, however, that we must be very careful. We must not think that this passage, the passage where he directly discusses verse 1:8, contains the essentials of Gregory's account of self-knowing. I suggest that he thinks his readers will recognize that whenever he takes up the question of the soul's attention to her own activities, he is also taking up a discussion that was simply intrinsic to the discussion of self-knowing. If I am right, then we find the topic discussed again and again through the homilies, but we find it discussed in a manner rather different from anything we encounter in writers such as Galen and Origen. Gregory focuses his account on how the soul must learn to recognize not only that her own virtues are activities which mirror the divine, but that they are activities given by God. They are activities that are, in some sense, in the bridegroom's own activities. Allow me to comment on a few passages that reveal this dynamic. In the first homily, Gregory tells us, quote, not to turn toward the flesh in our thoughts, but to look only to the soul and apply the language of love, pure and undefiled, to that good that transcends all understanding. That good whose enjoyment is the ever available opportunity of yet nobler desiring, because by participation in good things, that enjoyment stretches and expands our longing. In other words, Gregory tells us to focus on the soul and to learn that we must think of the ultimate good as an object of love and desire. The more we love that true good, the more we enjoy goods. Or in words he uses a few sentences later, the more we are filled with his beauty, and the more capacity we have for further desiring. The picture here is, of course, well known to everyone in this room. But from where do these goods come, and what are they? A little later in the same homily, Gregory likens the Christian soul making progress to Moses himself. The bride, Moses, kissed the bridegroom in the same way as the virgin in the song who says, "Let me kiss him with the kisses of my mouth." And through the face-to-face converse accorded him by God, he became more intensely desirous of such kisses. And just as now the soul that is joined to God is not satiated by her enjoyment of him, so too, the more abundantly she is filled up with his beauty, the more vehemently her longings abound. For since the words of the bridegroom are spirit and life, and everyone who is joined to the Spirit becomes spirit, it follows that the virgin soul longs to approach the fount of the spiritual life. A few sentences later, Gregory comments on the verse from the song, "Your breasts are better than wine, and the fragrance of your perfumed ointments is better than all spices." Here, the same account is fleshed out, but in less direct language. Quote, "The soul that has been cleansed gazes upon the treasure house of good things. Now, the treasure house is named heart, and from it the breasts acquire their abundance of the divine milk, on which, according to the proportion of faith, the soul feeds as it draws in grace. For someone who conceives of the heart as the hidden and ineffable power of the Godhead is surely not mistaken, and one may reasonably interpret breasts as the benefits and activities of the divine power on our behalf. Through them, God suckles the life of each individual, bestowing the food that is appropriate to each of those who receive it. So, the cleansed soul feeds on the breasts that are the activities of God on our behalf. Here, Gregory speaks first of us seeing the treasure house, but then he subtly changes tack and emphasizes that we draw from the breasts. If we see, it is because we are fed by divine activity toward us. But a further step is taken when Gregory discusses the spices of the text, the spices that are exceeded by the divine fragrance. He writes, quote, "The spices we take to be the virtues such as wisdom, temperance, justice, courage, prudence, and the like. And each different individual assumes a different sense as he is dabbed with them in accord with his own power and choice. The virtues are given. They are that which the Christian ascending toward God draws from the divine breasts, the divine activity, and yet they come to us as is appropriate. Now, I want to say clearly at this point that I do not think that Gregory has here a clearly worked out account of the manner in which divine and human agency interact. I do not think he has an account of what we might in Latin terms think of as double agency, although he certainly has the seeds of such an account, but nor do I think that his language warrants the belief that he has an alternative and well-formed account of divine-human synergy. We have rather hints and suggestions. The virtues that we have are given, and yet they are given in accord with the development of our own abilities to choose. So Gregory does not, I think, develop his account of divine and human agency in any noticeable way beyond this, at least not in these homilies, but he does devote considerable time to developing a parallel between the divine speech toward us and the gift of the virtues. And we can perhaps see this most clearly in the third homily. In that homily, Gregory writes as follows, quote, "The divine nature transcends the mind's grasp. Our thought concerning it is a likeness or an image of what we seek. Our thought sketches darkly in a mirror and in an enigma a reflection of what we seek that comes to birth in our souls on the basis of some conjecture. All speech, however, that refers to such intuitions has the function of some invisible mark, being unable to make clear what the mind intends." So far, then, Gregory speaks about the task of thinking God and the inability of our concepts, let alone our speech, to conceive of that which transcends us. But suddenly, Gregory changes direction. He continues, quote, "Hence, Paul says that the soul that is led by such intuitions to awareness of things that cannot be grasped must bring the nature that transcends all intellect within herself by faith alone. And this is what the friends of the bridegroom say. We shall make for you, O soul, certain likenesses and manifestations of truth. But you, when you have received these likenesses, shall become a dwelling place and a servant by faith of the one who is coming to recline within you by dwelling within you. You shall both be his throne and become his home." And then what this means is shown in the case of Paul himself. He became the palpable dwelling of the implacable nature in that it was no longer he who lived, but he who shows Christ living in him and gives proof of Christ speaking in him. Note the very clever adaptation of the scriptural text. There are two stages here. The soul senses that God is and commits herself to a life of faith. When she does so, the friends of the bridegroom, here I think the angels, elsewhere in the homilies the Spirit, lavish upon her gifts that enable a new awareness. But Gregory then develops a parallel between revelation through speech and revelation through this gift of virtue. Quote, "When the bride has approached the object of her desire more closely, but before his beauty is manifest to her eyes, she touches the one she seeks through her sense of smell, and she says that she recognizes his fragrance by means of the sweetness of a perfume whose name is spikenard. For, she says, just as," note the analogy, "just as you confer not the pure gold of the Godhead, but by way of concepts comprehensible to us, likenesses of gold, and do not disclose what pertains to it in clear speech, but furnish intimations of the object of our search by means of the laconic tracings of the silver of rational speech, so too I, in the fragrance of my perfume, sense the sweetness of that very one himself." So in this second stage of ascent, the soul that progresses in faith not only forms concepts of that which escapes her grasp, she also senses in her own perfume the scent of the divine. And this perfume is that which comes through the blending of the spices or virtues, as we have seen. And in the same homily, Gregory writes, quote, "The rays of that truly divine virtue shine upon the purified life through the apatheia that flows from them. And they, the rays, make the invisible visible for us and the incomprehensible comprehensible, because they portray the sun in the mirror that we are." It is not just any virtue that interests Gregory, of course, but the blending of virtues which itself produces apatheia. The flowering and blending of virtues in the Christian soul creates a perfume that reveals something of the divine virtue to us. Gregory parallels this process with our reflection on the divine speech towards us for a number of reasons, but one is because in both cases we are addressed. We are addressed by God speaking, and we are addressed by God's gift of the virtues. It is at this point that we can return to self-knowing. When Gregory talks directly about the importance of knowing oneself on the path toward the bridegroom in the second homily, his observations are preceded and followed throughout through the homily series by reflection on how one should view and interpret not the passions, but the growing virtues within the soul. And it is here that I think we see a real distinction between Gregory on the one hand and Origen and Galen on the other. The two earlier authors, Christian and non-Christian, share a belief in the importance of attending to the activity of the soul, its ability to develop virtues, and to avoid being overwhelmed by the passions. Gregory's approach is different, in part, of course, because of his ability to see desire for God as, in some sense, passionate, but also because when we know our own virtue well, we know it as gift and as a form of divine speech to us. Origen himself certainly differs from Galen in introducing the importance of humility. He directly contradicts Galen, but there is little hint in Origen's own surviving work on the song on the virtues as given in the way that Gregory speaks. One must, of course, remember how much Rufinus kept from us. But I am inclined to see here Gregory's innovation, simply because I find little of the same innovation in Basil's reflections on self-knowing. For Gregory, then, we know ourselves as increasingly received from God, and we know ourselves as living increasingly in the bridegroom, one might say. Here one might draw in texts from elsewhere in Gregory's corpus that emphasize that it is through the development of the activity of love that the soul participates in the divine life and activity. I think, for example, of his statement in On the Soul and Resurrection that, quote, the soul is mingled with God through the movement and activity of love. And there's a particular philosophical background and pedigree there that I think needs to be drawn out to fill out this picture. But I want to argue that striking though this theme is in Gregory's commentary, the one I've been setting out, we have so far missed one of its most important dimensions. Now, by way of introducing my second theme, I would like to note a feature of these homilies that I think is missed by many modern readers. There is an arc, a direction to Gregory's exposition. While he begins, or seems to begin, with the individual soul and her ascent toward the divine mystery, we need to bear in mind not only that Gregory spends little time here on the highest stages of the ascent, he's much more interested in the middle stage of the ascent, but also that homilies 13, 14, and 15 increasingly focus on Christ's body as the location for any ascent. Moreover, it is in this final set of homilies that we see in full the appearance of a theme heard sotto voce throughout the homilies, that the bridegroom adorns members of his body with virtues, not for their own benefit, but as a means of manifestation to and for each other. The way of ascent is given here a strongly communal twist, and a communal twist rooted in Christ's drawing together of those who have turned or have been turned to him. The basic concern of these final homilies in the series is actually announced fairly clearly in homily 8. Quote, if then the church is Christ's body, while Christ is the head of the body, forming the face of the church with the stamp of his own identity, maybe the reason why the friends of the bridegroom were heartened as they looked upon her was that in her they saw the invisible more clearly. However, in order to show ways in which this theme complements and completes my earlier exposition, I'll focus on just a few passages from the last three homilies. First, in Homily 13, Gregory emphasizes that Christ shapes the church by ordering Christians in relationship to each other. Quote, "He nourishes his body, the church, in the persons of those who are united to him in the fellowship of the mystery. And those members that are grafted into him through faith, he fits into the common body, and he fashions..." Richard Norris does use some good vocabulary. "He fashions a comely whole by fitly and appropriately assigning believers to roles as eyes and mouth and hands and the other members." And then, a few sentences later, "Anyone, therefore, who focuses attention on the church is in fact looking at Christ, Christ building himself up and augmenting himself by the addition of people who are being saved." Gregory speaks also in the same homily of the ways in which the soul who ascends instructs the virgins who have not yet ascended so far. But here, his focus is on instruction through appealing speech. Then, in Homily 14, we find something more and something quite striking in the light of my first theme. Gregory comments on the dense language of Song 5:13. "His jaws are like bowls of spices, pouring forth perfumes." The first bowl on whom Gregory comments is Paul the Apostle. Paul was a bowl able to provide food that was clear and perspicacious, suitable even for children. Why? Because the bowl that was Paul put off all earthly character at the time of his baptism, and he was then reconstituted a fragrant spice through the Spirit. So, to repeat, Paul the orator speaks because he has put aside his earthly character. But putting aside that character means also that he has the spice of virtue given by the bridegroom. And hence, in the sentences that follow, Gregory again interrelates manifestation through speech and manifestation through the gift of virtue. Paul, he writes, became a bowl for pouring out the wine of the word, but also, quote, "He brought forth the divine drink within himself, and through the sweet savor of Christ poured it out like a perfumer, blending for his hearers the varied blossoms of the virtues." In this passage, note that the analogy is reversed. Now, Paul's speech is effective because it is like a perfumer blending a fragrance. Before, it was the other way around. Remember that fragrance here has the specific sense of that which results from the blending of the virtues. Gregory pushes a little further, almost immediately, writing, quote, "Therefore the pure and perfect eye, which makes of the jaw a bowl that pours and gushes perfumes out of itself, this eye blossoms with lilies in the form of words that proceed from the mouth of those who have been beautified by the divine radiance." I think this is one of the densest passion of the entire set. In fact, Gregory is not really reversing an earlier analogy between speech as manifestation as virtue as manifestation. He is exploring ways in which these two phenomena should be read together. His interest seems to be in the virtuous Christian preacher and pastor who is used by the bridegroom in the building up of his body. Such a one exhibits virtue to other Christians as a gift from the bridegroom, and thereby manifests God and so draws together the members of the body. And naturally, a new speech flows forth in the midst of and interpretive of that perfume. Now, we may fairly question Gregory's exuberance about the Christian leader, but we should not fail to see that his picture offers a window onto an ecclesiological vision of the church as a body of divine manifestation, through which Christ manifests the divine and draws his body. Christ manifests not only through speech, but also through the manner in which he blends his perfume in the church, through the gifts that each Christian receives. Indeed, we should see Gregory here as adding to his earlier emphasis on the individual receiving gifts according to his or her capacity. The individual also receives according to the role that Christ marks out for them in his body. Toward the very end of Homily 14, Gregory writes, quote, "How blessed are the members through whose contributions the whole body becomes desire. By their perfection in every good thing, they produce a fascinating beauty blended out of all of them." I have argued that there is a progress to these homilies, a narrative arc, and that this arc moves toward an ecclesiological conclusion. This comment could be misunderstood. I'm not suggesting that the assent of the individual is forgotten, is absorbed by the collective. I am suggesting that the assent of the individual is shown in ever sharper focus by placing her activity within the broader context of Christ's forming of his body. Homily 15 is in many ways a synthesis of all that is to be found in the earlier homilies, and I'd like to point to one striking passage. Gregory writes, quote, "The soul that contains the uncontained, so that God tarries and dwells within her, has been beautified by the beauty of the one who indwells her, and becomes the heavenly Jerusalem, because she has taken its beauty to herself. The beauty and comeliness of the king's city, though, are surely that of the king himself." The soul is the city, and yet the city's beauty is that of the king. In the same way, Gregory presents a vision of the individual Christian that finds its apogee in a portrait of the city, but that portrait of the city is always also a manifestation of the Lord and King. Now, don't look at note 21, because it's a note to myself, pointing out that this passage needs developing much more, because in fact, immediately before Gregory talks about the language of the kingdom, he talks about the Philippians hymn, and there's a very interesting parallel, I think, between Christ's descent and the character of the beauty in the kingdom, but I didn't have time to develop that. Time is short. Allow me to offer two brief conclusions. First, these homilies trace an arc of argument that first exhorts the individual Christian to see herself as manifesting the divine activity through her virtues, which are also a gift. In this sense, Gregory redescribes the character of self-knowing, not only as it is to be found in non-Christian writers of the Common Era, but also in his Christian sources. He insists that we know ourselves most truly when we see our most noble actions as ours and yet as gifts, as a manifestation of the uncontainable. But second, Gregory pushes further and incorporates this vision of the individual into an ecclesiological sketch of Christ's body as a body constituted by mutually informing and manifesting activities of virtue. This vision is very different, I think, from anything to be found in earlier commentators on the song, and it is rather unexplored in existing scholarship on Gregory's view of the church. And it raises further question about Gregory's understanding of ways in which Christians come to know themselves best as used within the divine economy. Second, attention to this economy of manifestation forces on us some questions about the nature and purpose of these homilies. As I have perhaps already indicated, I think there is something of a danger in seeing them as examples of an individualistic mysticism of assent. It is not that they are not mystical, of course. It depends on how one parses the term. The homilies exhibit a deep concern with the church as a community and with the role of the Christian preacher. I did not have time to examine here the ways in which Paul is used as a model, not so much of the solitary mystic, but of the Christian leader who has ascended, but devotes himself to leading and teaching those who have not yet done so. I hope to offer something on this theme in the published version of this paper, and thus I find myself ending in a manner that Gregory surely would have appreciated, by promising more to come. Thank you.